Can you tell something about the Monroe Doctrine? Did the US successfully implement the doctrine? Does India follow any such doctrine? Okay, what was the Monroe Doctrine? Uh, there was this guy called James Monroe who was one of the presidents of the US in the first quarter of the 19th century. And this doctrine was put in place in 1823, if I am not mistaken. And this doctrine stated that uh, that European colonization will no longer be allowed in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. Let's take a look at a map of the globe. Okay, and what's the Eastern Hemisphere? What's the Western Hemisphere? The Western Hemisphere is essentially everything west of west of the UK. Okay, you draw a line across the globe from the North Pole to the South Pole, west of the UK, of the British Islands. Everything west of that is the Western Hemisphere. And there are two hemispheres, Eastern and Western. Okay, so the entire Western Hemisphere essentially is the Americas, North America and South America. And the Monroe Doctrine said that European colonization in the Americas and the Western Hemisphere would no longer be tolerated. It would be regarded as a hostile activity, hostile action by the US, and the US will not allow this. It also said that whichever European colonies already existed in the Western Hemisphere, the Americans would not do anything about that. They will allow them to exist, but no new colonial activity will be allowed, and so on and so forth. Um, so it was all about the US saying that we now own the Western Hemisphere. Um, and initially, in the initial years, the British supported the Americans and they enforced the Monroe Doctrine. The British, at that time, the UK was more powerful than the US. Okay, and they had a much more powerful navy than the US, and they actually supported the US in that, the UK. But in the late 19th century, the Americans developed a powerful navy and they became more powerful than the UK, and so on. And then eventually, the Monroe Doctrine took such a form that the Americans said that they would have the right to interfere in any nation in South America if it went against American interests. And they did that. They did much of that. They invaded and occupied various nations and did regime change operations, and then conducted elections to make everything look good, and so on and so forth. That was the Monroe Doctrine. But how did this happen? We have to understand the history, right? This guy Monroe puts forth the doctrine in 1823. But what was the background for this? The background for this doctrine was the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte was the emperor eventually of France and Italy, and he of the world, kind of following the footsteps of Julius Caesar, kind of, and he fought everybody. He fought every single European power, and he was very successful initially, but eventually he was exiled to the island of Saint Helena in 1815. So because of the Napoleonic Wars, various European nations like Spain, Portugal, etc., lost contact with their colonies in South America. And the governors they had installed in these colonies, they became independent rulers, and these nations gained independence because the European powers were too busy being embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars, which a period which lasted what, 15, 20 years, roughly, maybe less. Look it up. So because of Napoleon's wars in Europe, the various European colonies in Latin America became independent. And then the Americans said, okay, the time is ripe for us to now make our move. And in 1823, they put forth the Monroe Doctrine. So the US initially needed British help to implement the doctrine, but eventually it became powerful enough to enforce it on its own in the late 19th century and in the 20th century. Does India follow any such doctrine? India is not powerful enough to follow any such doctrine. Okay, if you look at India's neighborhood, India does not follow a Monroe Doctrine. You have Nepal, in which there is clear Chinese interference, which we ourselves have created the situation that has enabled this to happen. Our governments in the late 20th century, the 1990s, 2000s, essentially um, not enforced, but enabled regime change in Nepal, and the destruction of the last Hindu monarchy in the world, and the takeover of Nepal by the communists, Maoists, and pro-China elements. So we allowed this to happen. Our governments allowed that to happen. We don't have a Monroe Doctrine. We have an anti-Monroe Doctrine. We want everybody in our neighborhood to be influenced by others. We have we have Chinese interference in Nepal. We have Chinese interference in Bhutan. The Chinese claim Indian territory. Bangladesh is fine. There is tremendous U.S. interference in Myanmar. The Americans are bullying Bangladesh right now. They want to carve out a Christian nation out of Burma, Bangladesh, and Manipur. The Americans, okay. Um, there is Chinese interference over here. The Burmese, they gave a couple of islands to the Chinese in the Andaman Sea. When it comes to Sri Lanka, there used to be Norwegian and Western interference there. Pakistan is a puppet of the US. Afghanistan is kind of you could say a soft vassal of the US. So everywhere around India there is external interference, and allegedly there is even external interference within India itself. So India doesn't follow a Monroe Doctrine. India should follow a Monroe Doctrine, but that you can only do if you are powerful enough. You need to be a genuinely powerful nation. So India may be 20 years away from that. And the powers that be want to ensure that this never happens. So yeah, it's a kind of a very important phase in India's history, make or break kind of phase. Right now, India doesn't have the ability to follow, to enforce an Indian version of a Monroe Doctrine.